Hello everyone, I'm Omar Oakes, the editor of The Media Leader at Mediatel, and I'm really happy to be with you today for this webinar, which is about something very important, which is about our responsibility to the world, steps we can all take to change media for the better. And we've amassed a really great panel today to help us answer these important questions. We have, in no particular order, just the order that I'm reading this in as billed, is Lisa Walker, Head of Media and Sponsorship at Vodafone, Rachel Forde, CEO at UK, and Craig Tuck, Chief Revenue Officer at the Ozone Project. Before we get into it, very briefly, guys, 30 seconds, just explain what it is you do for a living. Lisa, what do you do as Head of Media and Sponsorship at Vodafone?
Well, hopefully it's self-explanatory. So I manage all of the consumer advertising from a media point of view for Vodafone. That's across the Vodafone brand and our two sub-brands, Voxy and Talk Mobile. And I also manage our sponsorship program as well.
And Rachel, CEO of what does that mean? Explain what you do for a living quickly, briefly, if you can.
Very briefly. Yeah, I work at UN. It's a media agency. We work with, privileged to work with a huge range of clients, from delivering joy in takeaways with Just Eat to trailblazing in consumer healthcare with Johnson & Johnson, to helping us all shop small with Amex. That's UN.
And Craig, the Ozone Project, most people in this industry know who the Ozone Project is by now, but for the uninitiated, in 30 seconds, what do you do?
So Ozone Project is a digital advertising platform. It's built by publishers for advertisers. I'm responsible really for engagement with brands and agencies. So everything that you would consider a kind of front office function within the business. And our raison d'etre is to bring incremental revenues back into premium publishing, quality publishing environments.
And no doubt we'll get into some of the specifics of that during this conversation. So we build this, for the benefit of the audience, we build this as 5 key steps that you can take away to change media for the better. But actually, when we had a prep call about this the other day, there were so many more things, so many more ideas than just 5 that came out of it. So we're gonna start off by saying something broadly about what should be done, and then we're going to get into the specifics because there's a lot in this. So if I go around the panel first of all, what are the key steps in your mind, for key steps that we can all take to change media for the better? Lisa from Vodafone.
I think the most important thing is, for an advertiser, is to be conscious of where your advertising is being placed. I think kind of personally, we all want rich variety when it comes to news and entertainment content, and professionally, we need a rich choice of advertising opportunities. But that can only happen if those publishers that are ad funded have advertising investment from brands like Vodafone. So the most important thing, I think, is to understand where your advertising is going. And I think through the growth of digital and the growth of DMPs, there's been a lot of emphasis on audiences, but sometimes that has been at the expense of a conscious kind of conscious placement and conscious decision making on where your advertising is going, because it's not just about audience, it's also about placement. So it's about just really having a little bit more control and visibility and of where your advertising is going, and so as advertisers you're making conscious choices.
Rachel, you're nodding along there. What key steps do you think broadly we need?
I think, I agree with everything Lisa said, and I know we're going to get into this in a little bit more detail in terms of actually practically how you can do that. But I think it is that step back of you've got to kind of audit the entire supply chain, haven't you? And it's it begins at home as well, in terms of how sustainable are you as an organization, all the way through to where you're placing your advertising dollars. So I think it's, and as I say, we'll get into it a little bit later on, but I think it's not just the end result, it's even like all the way back to production and casting, and who's behind the camera and who's in front of the camera. We've got a real responsibility to make sure that we are representing all parts of our diverse and wonderful society across the entire supply chain. And I think, as I say, we'll get into that a little bit later on.
Mm-hmm. Craig, we obviously are, you work with premium publishers. What for brands who may be unaware in terms of all the different parts of the supply chain, that advertising may be going on to fund publishers which aren't premium, what key steps do you think that they should be taking to actually look at their supply chain and clean it up if they're not already?
Well, I think I think as much as it sometimes feels impossible, direct is always best. As fewer hops between you and the place that you actually want your advertising to appear in is always the best policy, just to make sure that where you intend to invest the money actually does end up in those contexts and in front of those people. Going back to affecting change for better, or change in our industry that we all know and love and needs to change somewhat. There's societal factors at risk here if we don't get this right. Algorithms, I don't want to get into this and be too deep about it. We don't need that, but we risk very much a two-track society if we don't change. And we risk very much that two-track society where privileged people who have the wherewithal, the inclination and the ability to pay for quality journalism have access to quality journalism and can create an informed view of the world. And then everybody else who simply has access to social platform algorithms that basically give you more of what you want, never give you a different point of view. That is how those businesses work. That's by design. Or access to news that frankly can be automated and pumped out to a certain volume, such as cat videos is a great example. So we run the risk if we don't change of that very realistically happening. From an Ozone perspective, we are about creating a sustainable future for professionally produced, editorially governed parts of the internet, because they're the parts of the internet that people go to remain informed, entertained. Through the pandemic that we've been through, we've seen huge increases in readership from all of our publishers within our platform. And that's because it is indeed where people go to be reassured, to receive financial advice, to get clarification on a new ruling, to hear where we are with Brexit, to hear what's happening in Ukraine. Whether we like it or not, this is where real people congregate. And where attention is being displayed to huge amounts. So, for me, it's making sure as an advertiser brand agency that as direct an access to that it is struck as possible. And I see clients and agencies making huge steps in that regard, and things are changing, thankfully, for the better.
Very briefly, maybe you can answer off the top of your head. Have things gotten better or worse in the last 5 years, for example? I feel like it's been known about for some years in terms of what advertisers should be doing. Has it gotten better?
Is that for me?
Yes, Craig.
From my perspective, I think it has got better. I think think that clients don't know what they're talking about digitally at your peril, because I think they do. I see people in agencies that often get quite a bad rap. I'm not just saying this because Rachel's on the call, but they get quite a bad rap in this whole equation. Agencies got to make money and they're doing all kinds of things with advertisers' budgets. I'm seeing, and I can only talk about from my perspective, I'm seeing responsible frameworks for investment of advertisers' money. I'm seeing much more accountability and responsibility being taken by agencies to make sure that actually that spend is going where it needs to. I think the PwC report really started to highlight some of these issues. But I think it is better because advertisers are demanding that of their agencies. I think we've got a new generation of folks in agencies that understand maybe this a little bit better than previous generations do. And just generally, we societally, we understand our responsibility more so than I think we did. So I do think it's got better. I don't think we've solved it, but I think it's definitely getting better. The intentions are certainly in the right place, I feel.
Sure. And you reference the PwC report with the AOP and ISBA. Certainly, we learned a lot more when that report was published I think it was exactly 2 years ago in 2020. Required reading for any of you keeping up at home. So let's get into some of the meat of this. So specifically, what steps can brands and agencies take to ensure they aren't funding misleading news or hateful content or disinformation? Rachel, do you want to start with that?
Yeah. I think, building on what Craig talked about, and I think one of the moments as well, like, during the pandemic, obviously the hideous, horrific murder of George Floyd actually was a sobering moment that I think arrested people at huge scale. You think about misleading news and hateful content and discrimination. I think it did make us all kind of step back and, get us to, both inside and outside of industry, led us to question ourselves and educate ourselves on whether we could do more to help. And of course, the answer was no. We could always be doing much more. So at UM, we're really committed to, we have the influence, power and privilege to make a positive difference in our world by supporting causes and communities that need our help and investment. So really coming off the back, kind of like the background of this and then the Black Lives Matter movement, we initiated the open letter alongside Creative Equals, calling for our industry to rapidly improve the way that we engage with minority communities. So the letter contained a series of pledges, but one of them focused on scrutinizing our supply chains and to make sure that we are working with ethically progressive partners and channeling, our clients' media budgets responsibly towards platforms and publishers with aligned values. Now, this work is thriving, and most of our clients actually are engaged with it one way or another. And it's meant that we can actually invest in partners, so I talk about the, supporting ethnic minority groups, but then partners like, GalDem and Gay Times, etc. So actually, how do we make sure that we are consciously supporting diverse and minority groups and making sure that these platforms are getting our investment because they need it to, to thrive. So it's not only we have a better world media programmatic marketplace, but actually we actively put more money into partnerships, and actually they're incredibly successful. The Gay Times one we did with Nicorette was actually the most successful campaign we've ever done for Nicorette. But it's not just about supporting these diverse and kind of underrepresented groups. It's also then taking that step back. And when we talk about funding kind of hate speech and misinformation, dare I say it, there's no places that more than the social media platforms which are, fueling this. So it's not about blocking people out and actually taking them. It's actually working with partners to get to a better place. So another thing we've done is, again, coming around the time of George Floyd, was the 10 social media responsibility principles. So we hold all the social media platforms to task under varying principles, be it hate speech, misinformation, child protection, but the movement is all towards making an improvements rather than completely blocking out. I think we have to work together, not, as agencies, clients and partners, to get to this better place, and be a lot more conscious about where we're advertising and where we're spending media dollars, because we are, we need to support and be a force for good.
And Lisa from Vodafone, Rachel mentioned quite a lot there around what agencies can do. There might be a temptation from you to say, well, this is for my agency to do. I mean, building on that, what more is it? What more can you do as the brands to make sure that you're not funding hateful content, misinformation?
Yeah, so building on what Rachel said, I would say the advertisers have an equally strong voice. And ISBA is especially important to us in terms of being able to fuel that conversation directly with media owners, and I agree. It's not about avoiding certain media channels. It would be impossible for us as advertisers to just avoid advertising in social media, and it would be remiss of us as brands to do that. But we absolutely need to be working with the social media platforms. We worked very extensively with YouTube, 3-4 years ago, when they were at the center probably of a particularly damaging report around advertisers fueling hateful content. And by working directly with the media owners, we're able to make change for the better. So absolutely, I agree with leading in, being diversified in one's media, but also actually working directly in relationship with the media owners, because we as advertisers have obviously quite a lot of influence, but only probably if we act collectively, which we've done through kind of the Media Leaders Forum in ISBA. And then obviously, you know, that's easier to do with the big platforms than it is with publishers, because obviously the publishing world is extensive. But, you know, within programmatic advertising, you can actually exert quite a lot of control over where your advertising is running if you're setting up whitelists, if you're setting up PMPs, if you have brand safety software in place and you use the brand safety software responsibly, because unfortunately, as much as it's there to stop your adverts appearing next to hateful content, unfortunately, in situations like we had during the big early days of the pandemic, when coronavirus was, you know, labeled a disaster, and therefore all advertising was blocked on sites that talked about coronavirus. We've got the same problem again now, where anything connected with the Ukraine immediately signals a brand safety issue. And it's no coincidence that if you go on the Guardian homepage today, you'll probably find a house ad rather than an ad from a major brand, because again, we've got the same problem. So you have to kind of work out where to block out and where to positively lean in, because news brands are really, really important, and they will always contain content that, you know, that you have to either decide as a brand you want to sit alongside or you want to avoid. So again, it's always about being conscious of where your advertising is being placed, and making those conscious choices about where you want to be and where you don't want to be as an advertiser and as a brand.
Yeah, I mean, how do you guard against being I was going to say too brand safe, in terms of, you mentioned keyword blocking, and it's a particular concern for news publishers, that certain news stories they can't get advertising against because advertisers through digital buying will put keyword blocks on. I mean, are there more that you would expect media owners to provide in order to make it easier for you as a brand to avoid that happening, or is there more that you can, as a brand, can do?
I think there's a lot more that brands can do. I think if you have brand safety software in place, you need to understand what your keyword blocking list is, and where you actually make, you know, if you want to, conscious decisions to whitelist certain types of content. So a good example would be a news brand homepage. You know, ideally that should be whitelisted so that it's not blocked, because you will always have, obviously, you know, traffic drivers to news content, including right now content around the war in Ukraine. So I think it is, if you have a direct relationship with your brand safety provider, because, for example, you've in-house, or you manage your own tech stack, you know, do that as an advertiser. If you're actually if that relationship is managed for you through your agency, then have a conversation with the agency so they understand where you feel comfortable as a brand and where you don't feel comfortable.
Mm-hmm. Craig, do you have any figures off the top of your head in terms of the last 2 years since COVID has been happening? How much money has been lost by keyword blocking against COVID keywords?
A lot is not a figure, is it? But I don't. It's a real problem. I mean, we had an instance a couple of weeks ago. I think I mentioned on a pre-call, but you know, the word water was on an inclusion list.
Water.
Yeah, and I, you know, I mean, we're doing some work to onboard and offer our technical resources and ops resource and allow them to participate in the demand that we drive as a business for D&I kind of smaller, underrepresented publishers. I think we're getting into the weeds of the problems with programmatic, which is those third parties that verify from a safety and suitability concept for brands and advertisers within the ecosystem. Are they vested in advertising only appearing in premium parts of the web? You'd have to ask them. Does it satisfy certain agendas that the open exchange and the millions of internet domains see advertising appearing on them at scale? Probably. So I think that the more direct a conversation you can have with news brands, and with Ozone Project, we have our own brand safety and suitability product that is indeed increasing addressability of audience by over 50% as we speak, because you know, the word Ukraine in an article doesn't necessarily mean it's an unsafe article. the word crash in an article doesn't necessarily mean it's an unsafe article. It could mean Raducanu who's crashed out of yet another tennis tournament. So this is really quite granular stuff that, as Lisa said, real conversations between human beings needs to happen. And people need to understand exactly what it is you want to achieve. Understand that, you know, as the point mentioned earlier with social platforms, we don't want to avoid where lots of people congregate, because that's where advertising is at its most powerful. But it's having conversations in order that when we are in those environments, that brands are kept around content that is safe as a foundation, but suitable to that brand. And suitability means very different things to different brands. So yes, the answer is a lot of revenue. It continues to be a problem. But I wouldn't, I wouldn't say everybody in the programmatic ecosystem has the same agenda in terms of making sure that advertising appears where real human beings appear. That's a controversial statement, I know. But
we like controversial statements. Here's a controversial question, Rachel Forde. How helpful has it been? You mentioned George Floyd and the open letter from a couple of years ago. And we had at the same time a number of advertising boycotts against Facebook in particular, but generally a lot of the boycotts were directed at social media. How helpful do you think it's been for activists, pressure groups to organise these advertiser boycotts? I'm not asking for you to kind of say whether you support advertiser boycotts. I don't suppose you give me an answer for that, but how helpful has it been in terms of raising awareness, in terms of focusing minds?
I think, look, I think helpful to a certain extent, but I think, you know, Lisa referenced the YouTube issues of, you know, on the front page of the Times, you know, a few years ago. And at the time I was working at a different agency, but, you know, immediately we did advertise, you know, we recommended that our advertisers pause whilst we understood what the situation was. But as I say, then it is working with partners to make sure that you're raising the bar rather than eliminating, because at the end of the day, we know advertising works and there are certain platforms that you want to use. So that's why I do go back to, you need to work with them. So helpful in a way, but I still think there's so much more to do. You can't just say, oh, now it's sorted. So I think there's always something to do. So helpful to a certain extent, but, you know, as I say, even back then with YouTube, advertisers, most advertisers were back on in a week. So, you know, I think they're short. I think activists is short-lived, and I think that's why that's not going to solve the problem if it's just kind of that stop-start. It's actually how do you just continually raise the bar, if that answers your question, Omar.
It does actually. Can I put the same thing to you, Lisa, but in a slightly different way? How unhelpful are these calls for advertiser boycotts? I mean, for example, I've written in previous columns about I've been very much concerned by the boycotts which jumped on GB News when they launched a year ago, before anyone had actually seen the content. They decided that advertisers shouldn't be advertising on GB News, despite being a TV channel that's regulated by Ofcom, backed by Discovery, etc., etc. You might not like a lot of the content that appears on social media, for example, but is it necessarily, what's your stance on whether, do you think boycotts are too blunt of a thing to ask for, if I can put it that way?
I think that's a good question. I think it depends how, you know, extreme the circumstances. So I agree, you know, so I have taken action in the past to pause or to wait before choosing to advertise. You know, GB News is a good example where we never said we will never advertise on GB News, but we didn't feel comfortable to be there on day one. But then we also receive, you know, communication from pressure groups constantly for advertising in the Daily Mail. You know, my view is, you're right. If you know, within the context of British advertising, where you know, where you have Ofcom regulation, you have ASA regulation, you know, you have the Press Association. You know, I'm very comfortable with Vodafone appearing in a broad range of publications, and publications don't necessarily mirror my own political views, because that is what, you know, having diversified media means. It means addressing all groups, left and right, rather than choosing one group over another. It's only at the edges of acceptable thinking in society where there's potentially a little bit more risk if, you know, if views of a publisher is so misaligned with the own values, the values of your own brand. And there are brands that probably made slightly narrower choices than Vodafone have for very good reason, because of the role that their brand plays in society. And that's probably the best approach to take.
I think that just building on that as well, the importance of, I talked earlier about the free information economy and how important it is to protect free access to quality journalism, and that is largely through ad-funded effort. That, you know, we see massive overlap in our platform between readers on the Sun and readers on the Guardian, and readers on the Guardian and readers on the Standard or the Independent, and so on and so on. So I think that's actually a beautiful trend to look into, because it shows that people are, when they have free access to quality journalism, quality publishing, they can go ahead and inform themselves properly by taking on many different political leanings, points of views, etc., different angles, different takes on stories. What we absolutely, I think, are responsible for and have the power and influence to do, as Rachel mentioned, is to, I guess, make sure that our advertising is appearing in front of a balanced and well-informed group of people. The concern with social platforms is not that they're great vehicles and you know, they're fantastic. I mean, I'm a little bit too addicted to TikTok currently, but you know, they're amazing platforms. But it's those businesses that generate huge amounts of demand predicated on algorithms that show people more of what they want to see. That is a problem, because we end up with a one-track mind as a consumer, and you possibly see more of these boycotts initiatives where, having heard a different point of view, people might think differently. But if that makes sense.
It does indeed. Let's move on, because I want to get into diversity, which is really important. Craig, actually, I want to go to you first on this. How can we make sure that the advertising we produce is as diverse as our society is? And in order to do that, what checks and balances can you suggest that advertisers need to put in place?
Yeah, I mean, from a creative standpoint, you know, I've always had this dream that I'd set up an ad agency and I'd employ someone in Inverness and someone from every city between Inverness and Bournemouth to truly represent the UK when it comes to advertising plans and measurement and efficiency. I know that's never going to happen, but
it's a big old agency.
Yeah, you know, there's this thing that, you know, only people in Soho had iPads when they came out, and within the square mile of Soho, if it was a bad idea, it didn't get to run. And I think we've moved on from that, frankly. But in terms of what Ozone is doing in this area, we are making sure, because for sure it's true, smaller publishers, but critically important publishers to different communities of people, the Asian Median Group, The Voice, Pink News, etc., they either don't have the resource internally, you know, human resource to manage a tech stack, or to make sure they're correctly plugged into the huge amounts of demand that are driven through the programmatic ecosystem, and where they don't get to run a beautiful partnership like the one that Rachel mentioned for Nicorette, I think it was. Outside of that, their businesses are at risk. That sustainable future we're talking about is at risk. And more importantly, the community they serve loses a really trusted and valuable source of information if that's the case. So what we've done is we're taking an approach, and we've just signed our first publisher in the Asian Media Group to our platform. They benefit from the unique demand that Ozone platform drives, so it's programmatic connections as much as it's direct conversations with brand and advertisers, brands and agencies. They benefit from our tech expertise. You know, the Ozone isn't a charter that a few publishers sign to get on better together. It's a platform that's been built across a hugely valuable first-party publisher data set that is a deduplicated look at all of their audiences in one place. That generates huge amounts of demand. We want diverse and inclusive and ethnically responsible publishers to be part of that. So our technical expertise is plugging them in where they haven't been plugged in before. And frankly, I feel they've been preyed on a little bit by other tech intermediaries who all have, frankly, independent agendas. And then our ops resource, so human resource, we can put people in their businesses to help them optimize and manage the valued ad partners, because they'll have valued ad partners, of course. So we'll continue on that approach. The problem with programmatic is it's driven by KPIs. Those KPIs, in order to be driven to satisfactory levels for C-suites in brands and agencies, need scale. And if you're a diverse and ethnic and inclusive publisher, you're probably not of the scale of the Sun, of the Mirror, of the Daily Mail, of the Times, etc. And therefore, you're kind of not part of the conversation, and certainly not taking part of the spoils when it comes to the revenue. So we want to fix that. So we're about creating sustainable ad-funded futures for our publishers, and these publishers are now firmly part of that too.
Okay. Rachel, what checks and balances should advertisers be putting in place?
Well, I think back to, apologies, I think there's some background noise there. Can you hear some background noise?
No.
Oh, that's good. That's fine. I can hear it. I'm glad you can't. We'll cut that bit. So yes. So yeah, to answer that question, Omar, actually, so Craig, I haven't set an entire agency up of no, let me just say it again, because I'm going to say something about Future Proof Academy. Sorry. And I'm sorry, I'm just really distracted because I've got a drill. I'm having to stay at home today because I've got builders in and they're drilling. So as long as you can't hear it, sorry.
Let me tee you up again. Let me start again.
Thank you. Sorry.
Rachel, what do you think? What checks and balances can advertisers be putting in place?
Well, I think to build on what Craig said, really, about having a diverse workforce. I mean, I'm proud that we have offices all over the UK, but also how are we attracting that next generation of talent? So in terms of, trying to represent our entire society. So we have Future Proof Academy. So we work with community colleges in unrepresented communities. So talking, do a whole media program with 15 to 16-year-olds to try and actually get them to come and see the amazing media world that we work in as a career. But also it does give us insight in terms of how to engage with diverse groups. So that's something that we're doing at a grassroots level. Something a bit more practical at an advertiser level is we work very closely with UN Women. We work with them to bring to life their UK chapter of the Unstereotype Alliance. So we IPG founded it. It was years ago back in 2017 with Unilever, and we've now just launched the UK chapter of the Unstereotype Alliance. And with them, actually, we do a lot of research. So we have UK by UN, which it's research that shines a spotlight on unrepresented groups. And actually, quite frankly, groups that have been stereotyped across the years. So the one that we've just completed with them is Women in Heritage, and we actually delivered it at the House of Commons. It was a key part of the Unstereotype Alliance, but it actually identified how brands can best act against racism. And there's a huge piece. I'll invite you to it, Omar. We're going to do it again at our offices. But actually, it also, it helps brands understand how these minorities are feeling, but also in terms of new members that come along. So in actual fact, it's not just how you eventually get to, that's what I was talking about, it's the entire supply chain. So actually, it's not just about how people are represented in the media that we use. It's actually checking that supply chain from who's behind the camera and who's in front of the camera. So actually what's really interesting, the Unstereotype Alliance doesn't only have brands and advertisers and agencies, but all production agencies. So I don't know if you're familiar with APA. I was talking to them last night. They're an ad production agency that they're putting checks in at every single part of the journey, and they've got a huge stake in who's cast, who's editing. And so I just think there are so many bits that we can do and check. And I think you do need those checks and balances, because again, we're working in such a fast, frenetic, we're all agility, we're all kind of, moving at the speed of a swipe. I think you do need to take that step back. And even with all the good intentions, you may have missed something. So I think to step back and have partners across that supply chain to help you put those checks in is really important. And of course, then as an agency, when it comes down to where we place the ad, then again, you know, we've already spoken about that. So I think there's huge checks and balances across the entire advertising supply chain.
Okay, and Lisa, you get a two-part version of this question. So which ideas have you heard from Craig and Rachel that you're going to steal? And also, what have you been doing already in terms of checks and balances to make sure that you can meet this responsibility to make your advertising as diverse as possible?
Well, I think certainly from an advertiser's point of view, the most obvious and probably the most visible change that probably everyone's seen over the last 5 years is more diversification and more ethnic representation within the casting of our ads. The reality, though, is that, you know, if that's where it begins and ends, then that's pretty poor, because, you know, we have to have a more diverse workforce, and hopefully every advertiser is on that mission. We also have to make sure that we have a product portfolio that is accessible to all. You know, Vodafone, for example, has everything from premium kind of product through to basics. So, you know, we do have a product portfolio that meets every salary bracket as well as situation. But I think also you have to kind of focus on diversification, how you target your advertising. You know, Rachel, how often have you received a brief that said ABC 1 1634? Probably almost. I'd put the percentage at least 80%. You know, so we try and be very diverse in the products we create and probably the way we cast our ads, and then suddenly we write this really narrow, generic audience brief that we give to our media agency, which means that you just chase the volume rather than, I guess, the breadth of offering in terms of opportunities to target different types of people. So I think probably it does, you know, you have to work from the inside out if you want to actually authentically make a difference in this space, but you have to address every single aspect of what you're delivering as a manufacturer, as a service brand, but also as a marketing team. What are we doing to actually help or hinder having, you know, making more diverse choices in terms of how the products we create, how we position them and where we advertise them?
Okay, and now onto the very important aspect of carbon use in media, making this industry more environmentally conscious, if not friendly. There's been numerous studies over the past couple of years in particular, in which we've seen actually how huge use of carbon use in media. When you think about how much more media is consumed on digital devices, how much those devices are charged, etc., etc., etc. What specifically are you doing in order to reduce carbon use in media? Rachel, do you want to start?
Yeah, well, it's look, it's a question on many advertisers' minds. So it's like, how do we give advertisers tools and I suppose responsibility in terms of being conscious of what we're contributing. So we are members of Ad Net Zero. I think most agencies, if you're not, you should be. And part of that as well, we have the carbon calculator. So it calculates the emissions of any campaign. And then actually then so many of our clients now are then choosing to then offset that through an offset partner. So at least you know that whatever you're putting out into the world, that you're offsetting it from a media point of view. Also, I mean, outdoor is one of the industries where it is the only industry where it really is. It's an advertisement, but a bus shelter, and the outdoor world actually puts a lot of money into local communities. But they're generally a advertising piece. So our outdoor partner, we have we have a thing called Rapport Zero, and we offset, and so we offset all of our outdoor, and actually we will be so we'll be actually carbon negative rather than carbon neutral. So there's lots of kind of ways that you can now, again, it's that consciousness of what have I emitting. Of course, you know, also change begins at home as well. You know, what are we doing within our own organisation? So at our new home, the Bailey, is completely sustainably sourced. and its energy that we use is completely it's green energy. So we had the benefit of moving into a new building, so we could, that was our entire brief. So we do that. But then what about business travel? So, you know, I think one of the positives out of COVID that showed that we didn't have to be jumping on a plane to go to a business meeting. So massively reduced that. It's that whole piece of kind of auditing everything that we're doing. What is the impact of our day-to-day operations, and also kind of putting measure, measure what you treasure, kind of put a stake in the ground and show that we are going to improve. So I've appointed a head of sustainability within and again, I think most organizations are now recognizing that you need to name it. You need somebody responsible to help raise the game of us all. So there's lots of things that we can do, but obviously the digital space is obviously is a big piece of carbon right now.
Well, Craig, as a big part of a growing part of the digital space, programmatic media in particular, what have you been doing, and what can you do in the future to reduce your carbon use?
Yeah, so we're taking it very seriously. We've just actually successfully offset all of our carbon emissions from 2021 and year to date from our platform, from Ozone's advertising platform. That's verified gold standard by WWF. They actually give you a certificate as well, but we won't share that today. But,
and what does offsetting mean? I'm thinking loads of trees being planted, for example.
Yeah, so you, through the WWF, you sign up to certain initiatives, and ours is in, there's a South American reforestation project that we're offsetting our carbon emissions into. But it doesn't mean that we're net zero, of course. It doesn't mean that the business is net zero. So the process is one, first, of measuring your emissions and your output, then setting about reducing, and then offsetting. As I say, our ad platform is now completely carbon neutral. We've successfully offset those emissions, but we have to now look and turn to the rest of our business and look at the office that we're in, and the travel that people are taking, and the materials that we use, because the next step is, of course, net zero status. So we'll continue to measure, try and reduce and offset for that as well. You know, I would just say that, concerningly or not, the emissions that we did offset, I think, equate to, and we're a growing business and a sizable business now, those emissions that I'm talking about as offsetting equate to about 4 return flights to New York. So when you put that into context, and I saw some scary figures from BA, because they're making a lot of moves in sustainability themselves, and genuinely are doing quite a lot to kind of try and arrest that. You know, there are other industries, of course. Media is a massive polluter, but other industries too. This needs to be a global effort across all industry, I would say.
Lisa, what do you think? Obviously, Vodafone, as well as being a large advertiser, also a telecoms company. What more can you do?
Well, interestingly, obviously, we have to start with ourselves before we start putting demands on the partners we work with. And actually, Vodafone is now only uses 100% renewable energy across our whole mobile network, our fixed network, our retail stores, and our offices. So, you know, we have 100% renewable energy only policy. So hopefully that's something that our partners will soon be moving to as well. But I think as a marketing department, obviously one of our biggest impacts is the amount of communications we produce, physical communications. So, you know, the less often we are changing out our messaging in retail, the less often we are producing materials, shipping materials. So we have made a conscious effort to reduce the amount of campaigns we run, and certainly to create broader campaigns. So therefore, the swap out retail isn't quite as frequent. So it's probably a lot of our focus has been around how we make marketing more efficient, and therefore the impact we have, not just within advertising, but obviously from advertising right the way through to the posters in store. We're actually making conscious decisions to change messaging rather than thinking it's a constant cycle of change, which probably was a conscious decision, which is a move away from perhaps where we were 2-3 years ago.
Okay, we've only got a couple of minutes left, actually, so I just want to ask you all a final question around the broader question about how much can brands have a social purpose. This famously came up recently with Unilever and certain high-profile investors challenging the idea that a big FMCG company like Unilever should be leading so much on purpose in their marketing at the expense of focusing on the fundamentals of the business. I think the quote was at the time. Lisa, you're a big brand. Are you too big to have a purpose?
Good question. Well, you probably know, like most sectors, the telecommunications sector is incredibly competitive. So, and we have a big retail estate. So we have a constant pressure on trading, on driving market share and sales. But we also know that having a social purpose and a social, and demonstrating social responsibility is no longer a nice to have. It's a need to have. In order to have a sustainable business, to drive and maintain brand consideration and therefore market share. So we try and strike the right balance between purpose advertising and more commercially orientated proposition, promotional advertising. Last year was probably the first year we invested our whole Christmas campaign in, with the sole purpose of driving our purpose agenda. Was in our world quite a brave decision to make. It's our biggest trading period. We didn't advertise a product, a price at Christmas. The only thing we asked people to do was hand an old mobile phone into one of our stores so we could match it with data and give it to someone who is digitally disconnected. It was a risk, but it's a risk that paid off. And we now have very clear evidence that when you talk purpose, it also pays back in terms of, driving your brand forwards. So it's something we will continue to invest in alongside more commercially orientated messaging, because people expect both. They expect a brand to demonstrate value and service, but also demonstrate a contribution to society. So that will be a part of our marketing plan, and we have no intention to move away from that.
Well, that's really interesting perspective from one large brand in particular. But Rachel, as someone who works across many brands in the work that you do, how common is that? Is a story that you've just heard from Vodafone? How much is it varying between the different brands in terms of being somewhere on social purpose? Are they all in? Is there a spectrum? Is there a divide?
No, I think everybody's working on it. And I actually think, brands and advertisers have a real key part to play. When I talked about the women in heritage research we did with the Unstereotype Alliance, one of the key insights that we had from that was that brands and companies are perceived by society as having the greatest power to make progress happen in society. And this was amongst politicians, amongst the police. And so when you take that fact, it just evidences the power and responsibility that we do have in our industry for social purpose and to make change happen. And I love hearing the Vodafone story, and it's a great one. And I do believe that brands are amongst the most important platform and change makers. And if I think about some of our clients at examples like Mattel, amazing special edition Barbie tributes to change makers like Clara Amfo, and then Just Eat through the pandemic quietly gave away hundreds of thousands of free meals during the pandemic. And then the other extreme of Spotify, who launched This Is Now, which is a year-round Black culture platform. Those are just a number of examples where brands have truly risen to the occasion. And also it's amazing work that actually drives brand results as well. So I think it's on everybody's agenda, and it's not only is it a brilliant piece for social purpose, but it's a brilliant piece for brand creativity and driving results. So look, everyone is a winner in my eyes.
Okay, and Craig, if I could give you the final word on this, how important do you think it is for brands to have a social purpose?
I think it's really important. They're all great examples that we've just heard there. The what makes me, I mean, what I feel for brands and agencies for a little bit is that when they're being genuinely purposeful, they are still incredibly nervous about talking about it, because, and they've got to make sure that when they do talk about it, people believe them, and it comes across in authentic. And I think Dara talked in another trade publication about some Twitter research, and the word greenwashing has seen a 253, I think, % increase in its use in recent months on Twitter. That tells me absolutely, without doubt, on a free speech platform like Twitter, that people do care whether brands are being authentic, and that social purpose does matter. You know, with greenwashing being talked about so heavily, so it does matter. I think it's quite tricky for brands to navigate that right from end to end, as Rachel and Lisa have talked about. You know, from creative, from the team that sits within the building doing the work, to the execution of media at the other end. But you know, the key thing is for brands to be authentic in everything they do when it comes to purpose. And if the consumers can see that, then it affects change. It helps brands hit bottom line when it comes to sales, and agencies, I think, add huge amounts of value in that conversation by helping brands navigate exactly where and when to talk in those terms.
I happen to agree, and if I could just end by making a plug for the Media Leaders purposeful statement of values that we released last July, where we pledged to support excellence, diversity and inclusion, and courage in media. Which you know, if we're gonna write about these things, people should know what our view is as well. So check that out on the-media-leader.com. That's it. That's all the time we have. Thank you so much to Lisa Walker, Rachel Forde, and Craig Tuck for joining us today. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good to talk.